Welcome back, everybody. I hope you are very good. Today, I am joined by another great guest. I'm joined by Ash Grossman, who is someone that we've had on before. Ash is from the Training Stimulus. He mentors and coaches people in the art of movement, mechanics, overcoming injuries, rehab, that sort of stuff. So we've had Ash on before in episode 164. In that episode, we spent a bit more time going into his journey in the industry and how he got to where he is now. And in today's conversation, we spend a lot more time going into the technical aspects of what he does. And in particular, we wanted to pick out a few essential knowledge gaps that we felt we could fill in a podcast. Obviously, a lot of what Ash does is very technical and hands-on and like visually led and things like that. But we picked out a few areas we thought we could cover well in this audio format. We went through those. We talked about the body being a system. We talked about more flexibility, not always being the answer. We talked about the role of stability and tension within the body as well. And then I also got the opportunity to ask Ash about some of the other side of what he does, which is running a really good business. And I talked to him about how he approaches that and what he's done to build what he has built with the Training Stimulus. So it's really nice to hear different side of somebody and get the insights from them in terms of what it's like to run their business. So without further ado, here is my guest interview with Ash Grossman. Ash, welcome back, mate. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks. Thank you for having me. Glad to be back.
No, it's great. It's great to have you back on. I was looking before we hit record, actually, and it was almost a year since we last spoke. It was March last year. So for anyone that hasn't listened to that episode yet, go back to episode 164. We had Ash on there where we found out a bit more about your backstory. I know that things have changed for you a little bit since then, Ash. We were just talking off mic, like tell us where you are now, because we're recording this bright and early here in the UK because there's a bit of time difference. Where are you working from now?
I'm in Bali, so I recently moved out to Bali a few months ago. Since getting everything online, I thought, if I can work from anywhere, where would I like to work? Tried a few different places and settled on Bali, which seems to tick most of my boxes pretty well. And yeah, loving it so far.
I can't let that go without asking, where else did you try, Ash? Where else was on the list before Bali?
Portugal was actually, I was like all but committed to Portugal. And then I actually came to Bali for a holiday because I thought I won't move to Portugal until it warms up a bit. Like they still have a bit of a winter in Lisbon. And I thought, yeah, I'll just go for a holiday to get some more sun and then move in the summer. And then I came here, one of my mates lives here, and I just thought, why don't I move here instead? It's like that, but better. So
yeah.
Change the plan.
Brilliant. The power of being able to work from anywhere, eh? It's brilliant.
Yeah, very lucky.
Good. And we've brought you back on today because, as I mentioned, we've had you on before, but last time we sort of spent more of the time going into your backstory and how you got into the industry. You'd had a few injuries in that yourself. You were almost scratching your own itch, weren't you, in terms of trying to get to the bottom of that. So for anyone that wants to hear that, they can go back and listen to it. Today, we're going to go into some of the more technical bits around common things that coaches struggle with. So we're going to go straight into that, some of these sort of technical gaps. And one of the notes that you sent me ahead of the conversation today, I'm just going to tee this up for you to take it where you want, Ash, was the body is a system. So talk to us about that and how that relates to being a gap in knowledge that us coaches might have at times or not quite have made those connections yet.
For sure. Yeah, I think when I'm teaching personal trainers and coaches and also manual therapists like physiotherapists, chiros, osteos, one of the mindsets that they quite often arrive with that we work on is the idea that the body is just a collection of component parts which should be addressed in isolation. And I think we could go on a long rabbit hole about why that is around bodybuilding and simplifying treatment programs. So, you know, if you come in with a shoulder injury to a physiotherapist, they're going to give you exercises for the shoulder, and that on the surface makes a lot of sense. But the reality is that the body is one big integrated system and that everything affects everything else. And the analogy I like to use is that of a football team. I know you're a big football player, and I think it just makes the connections in people's minds a lot easier. where if a football team is losing lots of matches, you wouldn't just train each player on its own to try and get the team to perform better overall. At some stage, you would want to have them doing team training. You might separate attack and defense, but you'd always integrate the full team back together to try and get them performing better overall as a team. And that's the approach we should take with our bodies as well. There are some circumstances when you might want to work on individual body parts to get them functioning better. But ultimately, the body moves as one big integrated system, especially when we're doing, our compound lifts or full body movements, which is most of them in real life. Like even walking is a full body movement. So we need to get all the different body parts to speak to each other and work together as an overall team so that no one individual part suffers on its own. And actually, literally just now, one of my mentees, Lewis, put up a great example of a runner who was experiencing hamstring pain and had done loads of hamstring work to try and strengthen up the hamstring, as most people do. But upon deeper investigation, he figured out that there's a problem with his big toe, which was affecting his foot mechanics, which was affecting his ability to put force into the floor, to push off and extend his hip. So 3 things to work on, none of which were the hamstring, but those things immediately made an improvement to his hamstring symptoms, which, if we bring it back to the football analogy, as I always like to do, you can imagine a striker's not scoring any goals, but he might not be getting any balls because potentially the players around him are having to cover a lazy defender or a lazy defensive midfielder. So as soon as you get that defensive midfielder doing their job properly, it will free up potentially the other centre midfielder who can then supply better balls to the striker and he starts scoring goals. But the root cause of the issue is quite often away from where the symptoms of the issue are. And I think for PTs or therapists in the industry, going into all situations open-minded to the idea that the problem could be elsewhere and somewhere that's asymptomatic means you're going to deliver much better results because you're more likely to establish what's actually causing the issue rather than just managing the symptoms, which is the sort of negative feedback loop that I was in with my personal shoulder injury, which you can hear all about in the first episode.
Yeah. So in that, I think that's a good example for us to use then. So in that example of the runner and the hamstrings then, Ash, once someone has highlighted those 3 potential issues, and it might be a variation of what I'm about to explain, is a coach then going and dealing with those 3 things individually, or are you still trying to integrate it so that you're dealing with those 3 things together as a system? I mean, it might be a mixture of both. I'd just be interested to hear that once you've figured out, oh, it's not just the hamstrings, it's these other things. Do you still go at that from an individualistic standpoint, or are you still trying to attack as a team, let's say?
Yeah, that is a great question. And it is a mixture of both. So ultimately, excuse me, say we want the foot to supinate better. So we want it to learn to create an arch better. Ultimately, we want it to learn to create an arch better in running at the appropriate speed without thinking about it. And we might be able to work on it in running, but we're probably going to have a better chance on working on it slightly further away from running. So maybe with a lunge, maybe with a static setup, maybe with some basic foot drills on its own. And depending on the athlete, depending on the circumstance, will dictate how scaled back the movement needs to be or how high up close to running we can work. And that's why an assessment is so important, because it does vary from person to person. But ultimately, we always want to integrate it back into the movement that matters, which for this person was running. And if we, I'm just going to keep using this football analogy because I love it. So imagine the defensive midfielder wasn't very good at marking his man. You could get him doing some man marking drills, just one-on-one with some cones out, some constraints to sort of teach him the basics of man marking. But if in a game situation, he gets distracted by other players, loses his man, and is not marking that guy, that's useless. Like all those drills aren't actually helping the team performance.
Yep.
So he would need to practice his man marking in some attack versus defense drills in something that's a little bit more relevant to a full game scenario, so that we can trust him to do that job in the full intensity match. And movement mechanics is just the same as that, in that we need to find a level where we can get the right training stimulus, which is one of the reasons the business is called the training stimulus. And as soon as we're sure that we're getting it, then the job is to keep that training stimulus, keep that movement quality all the way through to the movement that matters at the right intensity, ultimately. Yeah. Running in a race without having to worry about the hamstring.
Yeah. Brilliant. And I know that obviously you go into like a level of depth that we can't possibly do justice on a podcast. But again, just to try and help the listeners out a little bit, you mentioned assessing there.
Yeah.
In a scenario like this, let's use the hamstring one again. Is it usually a case that someone is coming to you and it's that particular issue that they're looking to address? Or is it that you've maybe done a full body screening that's been highlighted, and then maybe you do a more in-depth screening around that particular issue? Like, how do you, because again, I think for the audience we've got here with PTs, people might come with a few issues, but probably not something as specific as that. So would they maybe go down the route of doing a bigger screening first and then maybe hone that in to get closer to understanding that specific issue there?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the sort of triage process is very variable. And the way I like to teach it is that you can do a full screen, but that you'll only use the aspects of the screen that are relevant to the person in front of you in the scenario that they're looking to work on. So they could be absolutely fine, can do all the exercises that they want, and they're making good progress. In that situation, you wouldn't really be bothered about movement mechanics interventions. You almost just keep training them progressively until something becomes a limiter. Maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be pain. It could be performance plateau, like, oh, I haven't been able to add more to my squat for 2 years and I'm not sure why. Those sorts of scenarios come up all the time. But once you've developed a good toolbox of screening weapons in the arsenal, then you can sort of pick and choose. And I think one of the best ways to use movement mechanics is to incorporate some of the assessment exercises into warm-ups. So you're actually getting them moving, you're preparing them for the workout that they're about to do, but at the same time, you're getting some great data on how this person moves and what their limiters might be. And for the great personal trainers that I work with, they'll quite often do a warm-up, do the training session as planned, and then they might adjust the accessory exercises that they use for that person. So they're addressing their limitations or addressing their imbalances without the client even knowing. So you're getting ahead of potential issues that might come up later and ironing out those limitations before they ever become an actual limiter, which I think is the underrated use of movement mechanics.
Yeah, perfect. And then I think just to sort of finish off on this point, because again, I think this is something I know in particular personal trainers might struggle with. Let's go back to your example there of the runner. On the sort of client side of that, I know you're dealing more with the coach rather than the specific client in this instance, but let's say we've got a client that likes to run, they've got this issue. How do you approach things in terms of potentially speaking to that client about the fact that, do they maybe need to do a bit less running for a period of time? Do they need to do they need to step away from something that's maybe compounding the issue? Like, how do you think about that? Or do you get them, because I've worked with physios in the past and stuff like that, and they're like, oh no, just keep doing what you're doing. And we'll work around it, and I mean, I'll be honest with you, I don't know whether that's the right approach or not, but I'd be interested to get your input on, should we be maybe saying to people, look, maybe take a little step back while we work on this? You might just be causing it to get worse. Like, what are your thoughts on that? And then maybe how to communicate that maybe.
Yeah. So the first thing to get clear on is what is the right approach for that person. And it does vary from person to person, which is why I'm very anti like blanket advice of like, it always needs rest or you should always train through it.
Yeah.
It varies depending on the specific scenario. So one thing that I teach is always to have a very thorough consultation to really understand their situation, to really understand their goals and where they want to get to. And that's going to be one of the things that changes how you talk to them about things. 'Cause if they're a casual exerciser versus an elite athlete, their attitude is going to be very different. And if you tell one to rest versus the other, they're going to receive it very differently as well. So once you know what the right approach is, I would always advise trying to dress it up in a way that gets them towards their goal in the best and fastest way possible. So if they do need to back off and rest, then you frame it to them saying, we want you back to training in this way or running these distances as quickly as possible. And because of these reasons, I think this is the fastest way to get you there. And if they're in a rush to get back to their training, you're telling them that they're going to get what they want by listening to you. Whereas if you're not that convincing in showing them the path to getting back to where they want to go, that's when people tend to do their own thing or ignore your advice because they think, oh no, he can't be right. Like, this isn't going to get me where I want to go. Whereas some of the best adherence I've had from elite athletes who I've asked to back off, but they then take ownership of the process and they can see, okay, I know how to lay these bricks one at a time, and I'm going to build these foundations really, really solid because I don't want to be injured again. And they felt the pain of the injury, and they don't want to be stuck in that perpetual loop of like injury, rehab, re-injury, re-rehab.
Yeah.
So once you put it in terms and show them that you understand their priorities, I think that's the best way to communicate over whatever intervention you're recommending.
Yeah, brilliant. So big takeaway there. The body is a system. Love the football analogy. I often use cars as an analogy because I grew up with a dad that was a mechanic, and this is almost the opposite of that. A mechanic would go in and change one particular part. They would change the bit of the car that's broken, and then the whole thing works. So this is almost the opposite of that. Don't treat it like a mechanic. Don't be like my dad. Be like Ash's football team. Yeah, there's your little takeaway from that section. And one of the other things that we wanted to look at that links in quite nicely to some of this, I think, is that this idea that more flexibility isn't always better, is it, Ash? Like, we wanted to touch on that because, again, I know, having been in the industry a long time, that at certain these things go in cycles, but at certain phases, there's been like big pushes towards like more flexibility, more mobility, and then it backs off a bit, and then it does the rounds again, depending on what the flavor of the month is. So talk to us about that. What does that mean, that flexibility, like more flexibility, isn't always better?
Yeah, so I think this is just a common misconception in fitness and outside of fitness as well, that flexibility is aspirational and you're a good person if you do your stretches because that's what a good fitness person does. And obviously, depending on what your goal is, there's going to be a minimum required amount of flexibility and range of motion required to get into the positions that you want and to do the movements that you want to do. But this is like a Goldilocks amount in that you can have too much flexibility. And actually, it's a very common issue I see amongst people who are keen on exercise or who've come from a background of like yoga, dance, or ballet, something like that. And their flexibility is actually what's causing them pain, because flexibility, mobility permit range of motion, but uncontrolled range of motion can lead to excessive motion within a joint, which is actually how we get some of the more serious issues like ligament injuries. So you can think of your muscles and tendons as tissues that stop your bones moving too far from each other. So they're like the suspension, the brakes, elastic bands that stop excessive motion. So if they are too long or they lack tension, those bones are going to go too far. And another great one is the seatbelt. If you think of it like a seatbelt, if the seatbelt doesn't stop you, your face is going through the windscreen, right? So you actually need some tension in that safety device. And for these people, they might feel tight in certain areas, but their objective range of motion is actually huge. So to deal with the feeling of tightness, they continue to stretch, but they're just adding more slack, more laxity into the system, which means the bones are going to move even further and they're going to place more stress on the ligaments and hit those end ranges with even less deceleration. So in those situations, more tension and stability is actually what we're looking to drive. And a slight reduction in flexibility or range of motion would mean they can perform their movements with less pain. So common examples would be people who squat arse to grass and they still don't have any tension in their prime movers. These people quite often experience injuries because they're just, say they're doing Olympic weightlifting, they're dropping really fast with a lot of weight and just going straight into those end ranges, and a lot of strain goes on the ligaments without the muscles actually kicking in and helping out until too late. So for those people, actually learning to fire their muscles sooner and to have more tension to start decelerating the drop into the bottom of the squat from higher in the squat is going to mean that they can squat more weight, but also less likely to run into those end ranges and put more stress on the joints. And it's a bit of a mind shift for a lot of people to accept that flexibility might not be a good thing. And when I tell people that they should stop stretching, they look at me like I'm crazy, but then they do it and they start creating more tension in the muscles, and all of a sudden the pains go away, they feel better. And it's just one of these simple statements that has just become prevalent as a truism without people ever actually questioning what's really going on.
Yeah. And I think, again, going back to my own experience and coaches I've worked with, I think the only excess flexibility that's often looked at or tested for is almost like hypermobility, isn't it? There's not,
Yeah.
we're sort of quite aware of that and the potential dangers of that. Whereas this that you're describing sounds different from that. It's not necessarily someone that's hypermobile. And I think that squat example is a really good example of that, actually, because it's not a movement that people would often associate with flexibility, a squat.
Yeah.
But obviously,
Yeah.
with there's levels of flexibility within every movement. So
Exactly.
in something like that, then, and again, I know there's only so much we can do in a setting like this, but let's take that squat example. How would you highlight that something like that is potentially an issue? Like this is like a flexibility issue. This is a lack of tension issue. Is that just judged by like the speed of the movement, the depth of the movement? Like what things are you taking into account there?
Yeah, really good question. So speed and depth would be two of the key things. And just to go back to your comments on hypermobility, you're spot on in that clinical hypermobility there are certain tests to do, but the reality is your level of mobility is on a spectrum, and you can be almost hypermobile, which means you can suffer some of the same issues that hypermobile people face without being clinically hypermobile.
Right.
And yeah, what we're trying to do in figuring out somebody's issues is what's the limiter? Like, what's the key thing that, if improved, would reduce their issues or their symptoms? And if their excessive flexibility is the thing, then that's the thing that we're going to be working on. And to go back to the squat example, the depth that somebody goes to. So if somebody can squat arse to grass with almost no resistance, so they can just fall into a really, like, in air quotes, nice arse to grass squat. That's great if you want to sit in a squat for a rest position, but not so great if you want to lift heavy weights. And so easy tests that you could do to establish this would be one, to just watch somebody do air squats naturally. And quite often people will like fall with no tension in their body. They'll fall and like bounce their ass off their heels and then stand up. And if you ask them to squat less deep, they would find it really difficult. So one of the tests you could do, just thinking about it now, is you could ask somebody to squat a quarter squat, a half squat, a 3/4 squat, and see how easily they come back from these partial ranges of motion. And if somebody has good motor control and they have good tension through the skill of doing a squat pattern, they should be able to return from any of those points. But if they can only come back by dropping all the way to the bottom and coming back up, we know that their muscles as elastic bands are long and loose, and they only give them some tension and some recoil when they're very, very long, which suggests that if they're doing very heavy squats, they're probably going to use the same strategy because they're unable to generate tension mid-range.
Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. I often get amazed watching. We spoke briefly before we hit record. I've got a 2-year-old, and you watch some of the body positions that he gets into, and squat is a very, very common one, especially when he's playing and he can hold that bottom position for a good 20
Forever.
minutes, half an hour.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't even cross his mind, and then at the end of playing, he just stands up.
Yeah.
He just held that position all that time, and then just bam, like body responds, stand back up, no problem. But yeah, it is funny again um, when you watch young children play and things like that. Because I've got two, you do notice how that changes over time. And my slightly older son now will do what you said. He can drop into the bottom of a squat quite easily, but there's definitely not that control there. There's not that,
Mm.
it's something that as his bones are changing length and ligaments and things like that, is something that his body's probably playing catch up with. Um, but yeah, it's interesting how you see it in kids, and then obviously as adults, we go in all different directions in terms of what our abilities are. But yeah, it's quite an interesting one to watch.
Absolutely. And I think, yeah, it's an interesting discussion around like when that changes and what the trigger for that changing is. Like a lot of people would say it's the fact that we sit in chairs, so we're in a partial range and the muscles tighten up, which there's definitely some truth to. But being out here in Bali, it's so interesting to see, people talk about it all the time, the Asian squat. And because people use that deep squat regularly and they never stop using it, you see like grandmas sitting in that deep squat as a resting position. I've seen an old lady, must have been at least 70, chopping vegetables on a chopping board on the floor in a deep squat because she's
Wow.
just so comfortable being in that position. And you just think, we all had it when we were children, but then some of us lose it because we don't use it. So I'm curious to see if other cultures kept using the squat in the same way from a young age through to adult. Would we also be able to maintain that position as a rest position?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So linking into that flexibility then. So flexibility isn't always
Mm.
the answer. It can be more the sort of tension and stability that, you mentioned in your notes. It's almost a bit underrated at times. Are
Yeah,
there any little tips that you can share, Ash, in terms of helping to spot if someone's lacking the ability to produce tension within a joint, and stability? What are the sort of things that you're looking out for?
for sure. Yeah. So similar to what we were saying before, the speed and control and ability to reverse direction mid range using partials would be a good indicator of whether somebody is able to generate tension. Just sort of a cool sporting example of this is that some people, when swinging a golf club, they really struggle with the half swing, quarter swing, or three-quarter swing because they only know how to generate power if they go all the way back and hit end range. Whereas very skilled players know exactly where to stop to reverse the motion for a shorter shot. So if somebody is able to do that in their movements, like powerlifters are actually a great example of this. If you think about bench pressing, they'll quite often work a partial range to create tension and control from shallow depth all the way through to deep depth to work on that particular component of the lift, which actually results in a smoother, more controlled um, bar path overall if they're doing the full bench press afterwards. Um, and in terms of stability, balance is the best indicator of whether somebody is stable. So we want to evaluate it, obviously, just stationary, but stability is a skill. So if you think about balance, people who can walk on tight ropes weren't born able to do that. They learned to do it, they worked on it, and they essentially tightened up the feedback loop from their feet and the proprioceptors in their feet to their muscular contractions and reactions in response to where their body weight is. And people who are often on one foot tend to have better balance than those who are not. So people who continue to play field sports as they get older tend to have better balance because in field sports, you're always changing direction. You're mostly on one foot. Whereas people who can be very fit and very strong, but always on 2 feet using the bilateral lifts like squats and deadlifts, they can often have like shockingly bad balance because they're never challenging their balance. They're never moving in different directions. So the real basic stability assessment is, can you stand on one foot? then if we're to advance it one level, we'd want the client or athlete reaching in 3 dimensions. So reaching forwards and back, left and right, rotating left, rotating right, and seeing how skilled they are in controlling whichever joint we're looking at with those directions. And just to sort of bring it to life as to why this sort of thing is important, a lot of people will struggle with certain movements and put it down to weakness or put it down to lack of strength, when actually stability is the thing that's holding them back. So imagine if you're trying to squat the heaviest weight possible, but you were stood on a Bosu ball, you wouldn't be able to squat a fraction of what you could if you were stood on solid ground. And what people don't realize is you could have the equivalent instability within your body of that Bosu ball. So if your hips are super loose and super unstable, you're trying to stand up a heavy weight from a shaky foundation.
Yep.
So you've got to learn to create that stability within your body to be able to express force with any real intent. And a lot of people are walking around all loosey-goosey in particular parts of their body, and then they're frustrated that they're not able to make the progress that they want in these normal movements. And I've seen it several times now, and it always blows people's mind when you see it. But you might get, this is a specific example. So there's a lady who had some pain, I think it's shoulder pain, and was struggling to build up to doing a push-up. She'd never been able to do a push-up. And we'd put her in the position and she would try to do it, couldn't do it. And then we identified there was some lack of tension and instability in her body, primarily through her core. So we elevated her feet, and anyone who's done push-ups knows that a feet elevated push-up is harder than a normal push-up.
Yep.
But what that did is create length through her anterior core. So her hips sagged slightly, so she got length through her abs, which created more tension, which gave her more stability. And then suddenly she could do the push-up. And her mind was blown. Her husband, who was watching the session's mind was blown as well. She's like, because he obviously has done lots of push-ups in his time. He's like, but that's harder. Like, how can she do that when she can't do one with her feet on the floor? And the answer is because it wasn't strength that was her limiter. It was stability. So once we gave that system more stability, she had enough upper body strength to do a push-up, but not from shaky foundations with that loose, unstable core. So what I would love for the listeners and PTs out there to do is just ask that question of like, is it a simple lack of strength, or is stability potentially the limiter here? And if so, how could we work on it for this person? And that might unlock the next wave of progress for them.
Yeah, I think an example of it might be a similar thing to that, but I've never realized it was that until you mentioned it there, Ash. An example I've seen of that is where, and again, generally in females, where might struggle with something like a kneeling push-up, even, with that type of movement. But then if you put them into like a plank position, they can hold that, like women can hold that for like 2-3 minutes. And it's like, hang on, you've got the strength to do that, but not do this,
exactly.
a kneeling push-up. And again, like, as you were saying it, I was thinking of a couple of specific clients in mind that was like, yeah, that's them. That's probably their situation. Just to sort of tie up this sort of like stability piece then and tension, assuming that someone has got what we might deem like good range of motion and like a generally good level of strength, then is the main potential issue here more of like a proprioception issue? Then is it more of like a connection thing, a control thing? They've got the strength, the muscles and the range and all of that there to do what they need to do, but for whatever reason that it's almost like a missing jigsaw piece or something. There's something there connection wise that hasn't quite developed yet and maybe isn't firing. Is it maybe that we need to look at this through that sort of lens?
Exactly. Yeah. Excuse me. It's neuromuscular. So yeah, another point we would have talked about is how important the nervous system is in movement. And when we think of a loose muscle, it's essentially not contracting when we want it to. So between the proprioceptors in the body and the nervous system, they are not telling that muscle to fire when we want it to. And it's quite a long discussion around the science of muscle contraction. But essentially, the only way that a muscle will efficiently contract is subconsciously using something called the muscle spindle, which hopefully people have heard about from their level 3 PT. It's normally framed as a safety and protective mechanism, but it's actually the only subconscious mechanism by which a muscle can contract. And this is why we focus on creating length in the muscle to activate it. So normally when we think about activating a muscle, we're trying to contract it, we're trying to shorten it. And that works for bodybuilding when we're trying to just hypertrophy one muscle locally. But in terms of fluid, efficient movement, muscles naturally lengthen and shorten in a flowing flux between the two states. And to get a good contraction through a muscle, we have to put the requisite amount of length into that muscle to stimulate that stretch reflex. Just like an elastic band, if you don't stretch it enough, you're not going to generate any tension in it. You're not going to ask it to shorten afterwards. So for these unstable or more hypermobile people, their muscles are in that long, loose, slack state. So we have to put in more length into those muscles to then ask them to shorten. If you've got that short rubber band and that thin rubber band with no tension in it, and you're trying to get it to ping shorter, it's never going to happen. You have to first lengthen it. We always say lengthen to strengthen. So if we go back to that push-up example, her core, if we got her to do crunches, she would probably struggle to create contractions in her abs because they're so long and loose. So by elevating her feet and allowing her hips to sag below where they would normally do, that's creating a lot of length through the anterior core. And if you put enough length through a muscle, at some stage it has to contract because it will stop the joints going too far, stop the bones moving away from each other too far. So if we know how to lengthen muscles, we can activate any muscle in the body through position, through setup. So that's the general principle, that we want to create length in the muscles to force them to contract naturally and subconsciously. And then the nervous system can learn how to control that motion and therefore activate the muscle reflexively rather than consciously.
Yeah, brilliant. I hope you were all taking notes then. You just had a little mini biomechanics degree in. Well,
Okay.
so some really, really good takeaway points there, Ash, for people that are interested in sort of the technical side of this. And obviously, there's only so much we can go into on something like this. You need to go and reach out to Ash and ask for help if you want more help with this sort of stuff. Okay, this is the type of person you need to be spending time with. Ash, the other side of things that I wanted us to speak about today, because it's not something we often get to dig into with people, but on this show, we do want to give people technical skills, and we also want to give them some of the skills required to stick around long enough in the industry that they actually get to the point where they've become an expert and, you know, their business has survived long enough that they get the chance to go and do courses, go and learn more, go and find their place in the industry. And unfortunately, it is an industry filled with like charlatans and people that make huge claims that have never actually ran a fitness business or anything like that. So something I'm sort of keen to do is when we bring guests on like you, is speak to you about something that maybe you don't often speak about or get to speak about. But you've obviously got a really good level of experience now of being a fitness business owner. You've sort of evolved over time. It's had different phases. We've just spoke about the fact that you're now entirely remote. It's all online and things like that. So just talk to us a little bit. Like, we're going to keep this fairly broad and free flowing. Like, just talk to us about your thoughts around being a good business owner in the fitness industry. Like, maybe some of the things you've learned along the way, because I know our audience need this information from more people like you, as opposed to, you know, Mr. 25 grand a month or whatever.
Yeah.
So let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think it's a really good conversation and not one that's had often enough by non-business mentors. And I think there's two ways I see how to run a good business. The one is being really good at the business side of things. And there's a lot to be said for developing skills in sales and marketing and having the tactics and playbooks for how to make sales and bring money into the business. But I think that's only worth investing in if you have a good product to start with. You fundamentally need to be able to deliver on the promises that you're making to your clients to justify taking money off them. Like you said, there's a lot of charlatans out there who are incredible at sales and marketing, but terrible at fulfillment and delivering what they have promised to. And that's one of the sad things about the industry that gives it a bad reputation, is that a lot of people promise the world and take money off everybody, but then, don't live up to the expectations. So for me, probably the first piece of advice I'd give is just to get really good at your job so that people talk about imposter syndrome a lot. If you know you can do what you say you can do, you won't feel like an imposter. So whatever you need to do to be sure that the price you're asking somebody to pay is worth it for them, do it. So could be getting your skills, getting qualifications, learning like specific knowledge. It could be just doing shitloads of reps and getting a bunch of testimonials, which might mean doing discounted or free work at the start so that you can prove the concept. And, if somebody's trying to buy something from somebody else, a service, the best evidence that they can do what they say they can do is that they've done it 100 times.
Yeah.
So in the early days, until you've got that body of evidence to prove you can do what you say you can do, you've got to do a bit of a deal with some people. They take a chance on you, and you get some money or no money, but you get a great testimonial to show that you actually can deliver that skill. And for me, I always entered the fitness industry knowing I was going to specialize in movement mechanics because that was my passion. Like you said, I was scratching my own itch, and that naturally meant that I had differentiated myself from other people in the fitness industry because it was a rare skill. And this kind of relates to being good at your job. If you're good at doing something that not many other people can do, that naturally drives up the value because it's a scarce resource. Whereas if the thing that you do well is done well by everybody, it naturally becomes a race to the bottom because more and more people can do it every year. So the competition becomes greater and it drives prices down. So if you do something a bit more niche, and it doesn't necessarily mean you have to do one thing that's super rare. It could be that you specialize by the type of person you help. So tons of people specialize in fat loss, but if you specialize in fat loss for accountants and you understand accountants and their lifestyle more than anybody else, that could be a great way to differentiate yourself. Or it could be differentiation through two minor specialities. So for me, I naturally fell into movement mechanics and happened to work a lot in CrossFit, and those two cross over really well. But if there's X number of people interested in CrossFit, then there's going to be a subset of those people who are also interested in movement mechanics. And the number of people who work in that space is growing now because I'm teaching a lot of people in that space. But when I started was very small, and that naturally meant that the supply was low, so the demand is relatively high. So I think having that in the back of your mind when you're starting out is a really good frame to make decisions by.
There's three things there that Ash said that I wanted to sort of pick up on and just elaborate on. I hope I remember all three as I start talking about them. You mentioned about having you've got to have a great product. And I think that something that's often overlooked when you are qualifying is obviously you're learning like training, programming, basic nutrition stuff and things like that. But I don't think many people are actually piecing that together as they're learning it. So I would sort of encourage people as you're doing your level 3 or maybe some of the stuff after that, you need to be immediately asking yourself, how does this fit into my offering? What is it that I actually want to offer as a result of learning this stuff? What am I packaging together as a service, as a product, whatever you want to call it? It doesn't matter. It's not just a case of having this catalog of knowledge. Obviously, it's nice to be able to pull out information here and there, but how are you actually fitting it together? Because I actually believe that if you do that, being a great PT is actually a niche, because
Mm.
unfortunately, that there are lots of PTs out there that I wouldn't consider great, that they've not pieced the information together yet. So even just being a great PT without necessarily a specialism yet, I do believe is a niche. If you can be the person that starts piecing this stuff together. The other thing Ash mentioned there was like testimonials and stuff, and maybe working like undercharging a little bit. And again, that's something I speak to people about. And the reason that works is through something called pre-framing. Okay. If I'm going to speak to Ash now and I'm going to say to Ash, Ash, I've got a car that I want you to buy, mate. It's 10 grand. Are you interested? Ash has got no pre-frame. He's got nothing to judge that by. Whereas if I say to Ash, Ash, I'm selling a Ferrari, it's 10 grand. He's thinking, yes. Like, he's not even bothered about what condition it's in. He's like, yeah, I'll take the Ferrari. And what your testimonials, what that feedback does is it creates a pre-frame for people that come into your business. They're already coming in with an idea of what you can do and the value you can deliver and stuff like that. So again, I think often people just look at a testimonial as, oh, it's just a before and after picture. But it creates something untangible. You know, you can't really measure
Mhm.
it, but it creates this frame through which people are now seeing you as an expert in your business. And as I thought might happen, Ash, I've forgotten the third thing I was going to mention.
While you're thinking, I can build on your first point to buy you some time. And thinking about how what you're learning fits into your offer, I think is a great mindset. And it kind of reminded me of a couple of people that I've worked with, in that when you think about crafting your offer, complementary skill sets, like you should look at things and ask whether they're complementary skill sets. So a lot of my mentees are manual therapists who love training, but they don't necessarily have a training qualification. Some of them do, and the best ones do actually. But say you're a osteopath, a chiropractor, a physiotherapist, you're getting a lot of people coming in with acute injuries and you're helping with those early days of rehab. But like the common complaint that I hear from them is they know they can only take them so far and they don't know how to bridge the gap from those early rehab days to full training or full sport that they were doing before they got injured. So that's why they want to learn the movement mechanics stuff. So it's a really natural combination of skills to learn. They already have the treatment and the rehab, then they want to learn some movement mechanics and basic strength and conditioning principles so they can do the full journey. And that means their offer is so much more comprehensive now. They can say, look, I know you've just had surgery. I can do your early rehab and I can take you all the way through to full intensity training again. And some of them are qualified personal trainers and coaches as well. So once they're fit and completely back ready to go, they can do their training program as a fully able person from that point onwards. So having that foresight to see how do these different skills work together. In that example, a physiotherapist might not be so interested in nutrition because it's not, the people who come to them with injuries probably aren't there is some usefulness to monitoring your diet when you're injured, but it's not such a natural combination of skills. So some people seem to just go for every bright, shiny object qualification that's out there to add as many letters to the end of their name on their business card as possible. But 2 or 3 really targeted selections, I think, are more powerful than a random selection of things that don't really work together.
Yeah, and stacking those things together. I have remembered the third thing. You sort of
There you go.
started touching on almost the idea of like niching yourself and carving out this space for yourself. And you mentioned the example of weight loss, but weight loss for accountants. And I wanted to add to that that I do also think if you're not at a stage yet where you can clearly define who you want to work with, like Ash's example there, another way to niche yourself is just the way you approach that problem. So in the weight loss example, you might have a coach who approaches weight loss, and the way they're niching themselves or thinking of niching themselves might be, well, I'm the weight loss coach that helps you lose weight without giving up wine and still being able to eat out and this, that, and the other. Whereas your approach might be different to that. You might think, well, actually, my approach is weight loss, but with health as the primary driver. I want someone eating as healthy as possible I
Mm.
don't want them still eating McDonald's just because it fits the macros. I would
Mm.
take a different approach. So you can look at it from the other side. You can look at it not necessarily just in terms of the audience. You can look at it in terms of your approach as the coach, how you bring that. A really obvious example that often tends to happen is if you're a vegan and you're a coach, even if you don't advertise the fact that you work with vegans, you will attract more vegans because they see you doing vegan things and they'll be attracted to you. So I don't know if that's a correct term, vegan things, but
Yeah.
hopefully that made sense. So I'm just trying to help people understand that when it comes to, because I can imagine there's people listening to this that are early in the journey thinking, oh, I've not got a niche yet, and this, that, and the other. And it's like, that's fine. But if you've got a particular thing that you're good at helping people achieve, maybe look at that and then maybe start to think more deeply about how does my approach to that maybe set me apart from the way other people are doing it? Or do I even make people aware of what my approach to that is? Because if you make people aware, they might be more interested in it because you can go and get weight loss from anywhere.
Mm.
But do I want Slimming World's approach or do I want your approach? I don't know what your approach is yet. So maybe you need to send that message in my way so that I'm aware of it. I hope that makes
That's
sense
great.
with people. It's just a
That's
different
great.
way
No,
of
I,
looking at
I
it.
love that. Yeah, I love that way of looking at it. And yeah, doing vegan things as well. That's
We'll put that in a quote card.
yeah.
So Ash, it's
Yeah.
been a great conversation. Anything else to finish off with? Any other little wisdom around the business side of things? Because it is something that you've done a good job of. I think the main way you've done it is just by being great at what you do. I do think that's what you've managed to do, haven't you? Like
Thank you.
you clearly are an expert at what you do, um, and it's great to have seen you grown because of that. So if people want to find out more about you, Ash, where should we send them? Where should they come and find you?
My Instagram is ashgrossman.coach. That's where I'm most active online. If you'd like to get some free learning resources, thetrainingstimulus.com. There's a couple of free downloads to get some basic introductions to movement mechanics and our approach at the Training Stimulus. And I also co-host a podcast called Lunge and Lift. We're on a little hiatus at the moment, but there's plenty of good stuff in the archives where if you have a scroll back through the titles, I'm sure you'll find something interesting. We've had some amazing guests on as well. So yeah, check those out.
Brilliant. Brilliant. And we'll make sure that we link up to all those things when we're sharing clips and stuff on social media. So you'll be able to find it all. And I'm sure, Ash, we'll probably have you on again at some point, if that's
Yeah,
okay.
I'd love it. Love it. Make it an annual affair.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll book it in now, ready for next year.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Thank you very much again, Ash. And take care, mate.
My pleasure. Have a great day, bud.
So there you have it. I hope you will join me in thanking Ash for such a great interview, such a great level of insight into what he does. I hope you took a lot away from this in terms of the way you maybe think about a few things, maybe helps you with a few struggles that you've got at the moment with clients you're currently working with, gives you a different way of looking at things. And then from the business perspective, I hope that that sort of puts you in the right mindset in terms of how to approach this game and this industry and do as well as you can within the industry. So if you'd like to join me in thanking Ash, make sure that you head over and give him a follow on social media. Make sure you check out the Training Stimulus. If you've just listened to the episode, maybe take a screenshot and tag him on Instagram. That's his main place of activity. It'd be nice to know or let him know that you've listened to the episode and found it useful. And the absolute best thing you can do for us, if you want to give a little back, is if you head over to your podcast app now and leave this episode a rating and review. It helps this particular episode reach more people, and it helps the show, of course, reach a wider audience of PTs, coaches, gym owners, and anyone related to the work that we do. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, take care.